following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is the last of a 5-part City Talk series on immigration, the paramount domestic issue facing the United States today. The immigration debate tells us much about who we are as a nation and who we want to be. In the previous 4 programs, we talked about citizenship and the law, domestic violence, family immigration, and education. Today's topic is federal and state legislation and the impacts of these bills. These shows, running from April 30th through May 4th, coincide with the 5th annual Daily News CUNY Citizenship Now call-in. Joining me as co-host, commentator, and today, principally as a guest, is Alan Wernick, a professor of law at Baruch College and chair of CUNY's Citizenship and Immigration Project. His column, Immigration Advice, appears in the Daily News twice a week. Alan is also the author of U.S. Immigration and Citizenship, Your Complete Guide, and it's in its 4th edition. My other guests are New York State Assemblyman Adriano Espaillat, representing the 2nd Assembly District in Northern Manhattan. The Assemblyman is the first Dominican American elected to a U.S. state legislature. And the other guest is Juan Gonzalez, award-winning longtime columnist for the Daily News, a self-avowed troublemaker, and one of the 100 most influential Hispanics in the United States. Welcome, Assemblyman. Welcome, Mr. Gonzalez. Alan, what's the story with immigration? Times on Sunday, the 22nd, says progress on immigration. Lay out the issues and where we are.
Well, since the Bush presidency began, there's been a lot of talk about reforming immigration, and particularly trying to find a way to provide legal status for the estimated 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. And after 9/11, a lot of this talk went by the wayside, and recently, in the last couple of years, it's come back, the debate around immigration reform. And what's happening now is that we're waiting to see whether there will indeed be reform. On the House of Representatives side, there has been a bill introduced that provides the elements, the basic elements that people are saying we need in terms of immigration reform. First, a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, increased enforcement at the border, and increased enforcement against employers who hire undocumented workers. Now, the House bill, introduced by Gutierrez and Flake, seems to have the most support among pro-immigrant groups. There's also on the table a proposal from the Bush White House that's being discussed with members of the Senate who are looking to find a bill of their own. Both of these bills have 3 elements in common. One is there's a strong enforcement provision. And in the Bush proposal especially, there's an emphasis on what we call enforcement first. That is, there's a trigger.
And this is a key term, trigger.
That's right. The idea is that in order for the federal government to go forward with the legalization and temporary worker program, the idea is that first, all the enforcement mechanisms have to be in place.
It sounds like a poison pill.
Well, it is. I think it's a poison pill for a lot of people because it really delays the legalization for an indefinite period of time. And a second provision that seems to be being demanded by the more conservative members of Congress is called the touchback provision. And the idea there is that before a person could get permanent resident status or a path to citizenship, they would have to go back to their country and then return to the United States. Well, the problem is that there's so much discretion at the border and at the U.S. consulates, and most immigrants know that if you go to your country, you may never come back.
And this is really putting them at the end of the line, in fact.
Well, and that's a third provision, and that's the back of the line provision. The back of the line provision is that everyone who's in line to get permanent residence now needs to get permanent residence before anybody can get legalized. Now, in the Gutierrez-Flake version, there are more visas for family immigration. So, you know, while legalization applicants will have to go back to the line might not be too long. But under the Bush bill, there's no more visas. So we're talking about 15, 20 years before a person can apply for permanent residence. In the meantime, they get temporary worker status. Each time they apply for temporary worker status, good for 3 years, they have to pay $3,500, and they have to pay a $10,000 penalty before they actually get legalized. So for some people, for most people, we're talking $20,000 to $30,000. Under the Bush plan, it's substantially less under the Gutierrez Flake plan. But you know, overall, I would say I think this is the wrong time to be expecting to have immigration reform with the elections coming up. It's just so controversial. And as I wrote in the news, you know, there doesn't seem to be, you know, a hero coming forward or a mass movement to shake the consciousness of the country. And without a political hero and without a mass movement to shake the consciousness of the country, I don't think the people in Washington are going to get the job done.
Okay. Juan and Assembly Member, you folks are on the ground in one way or another. What is the feeling in the communities? What's going on the ground in New York and elsewhere?
Well, I think first of all we got to start with what happened last spring, which were clearly the largest mass demonstrations in the history of the United States on any issue. Whether it's the war, whether it's labor, the country had never seen an outpouring of people into the streets in so many cities, record numbers in Denver, in Dallas, and Los Angeles, even in Nashville, Tennessee, so that you had huge numbers pour out into the streets of largely not only undocumented immigrants, but many legal immigrants and their supporters who said the Sensenbrenner bill and this attempt to criminalize anybody at felon status and anyone who helped them, who involved with undocumented immigrants, had to stop. So that movement, to one degree, was largely successful in that it stopped the Sensenbrenner bill and it stopped the most draconian efforts. However, I would think, when you were saying before that a lot of the immigrant groups are supporting the Gutierrez Flake bill, my sense is that it's largely the more established immigrant groups. That same grassroots movement doesn't want a touchback provision.
That's right.
They don't want some of these other concessions that are already in either one of the Bush bill or the Gutierrez Flake bill. So I think what's going to happen increasingly is that this spontaneous movement that developed is going to be heard again. And I think what's going to happen now is not going to be heard necessarily because there's no really draconian measure as there was with Sensenbrenner. But I think what's really riling the street right now is these enormous raids that have been occurring across the country. Whereas the Bush administration, on the one hand, is saying it wants a comprehensive bill. On the other hand, in practice, it's cracking down in an unprecedented way, you know, trying to throw as many people out of the country as they can. And I think at some point, there's going to be a reaction to this, and by the same folks who are toiling in the shadows right now, saying, "Hey, if you're debating immigration reform, stop trying to attack us while you're reaching consensus on what the proper way to go is."
Before we turn to what's happening in the legislature and in the streets of New York and suburban counties, you're suggesting that there's a real divergence between the mass and the established immigrant group leaders, and the mass is leading the leaders.
Absolutely.
To a large degree, yes. Most of the leaders of the immigration reform movement, the established organizations, were caught unaware by the enormous outpouring into the streets.
And you see that the real movement is on the grassroots assembly.
Absolutely. I think that, first of all, I think that this massive movement is being ignored and downplayed by the Washington establishment. I think that they want to make believe that it never happened. And if those that believe that happened, because they saw it on TV, want to believe that it was mainly undocumented people that are unable to vote. So there's really an effort to downplay the massive aspect of this movement. And in New York State, I think that to some degree, the established immigration groups were caught unaware. They were, you know, they fell asleep at the wheel, and they reacted after this movement, which, by the way, I don't know if any one of us can really identify one particular leader or two particular leaders in this movement. It's somewhat, you know, anonymous, if you may. And the streets of New York, I think that a lot of things are happening. One, I think that there's been a reaction from some of the, the right-wing groups. You see that in Suffolk County, being led by its executive, Steve Levy, who has supportive measures of deputizing local law enforcement and the raids and enforcing, having selective enforcement practices, for example, with the housing codes, raiding houses because there may be 2 or 3 families living there. But he doesn't enforce those laws in the Hamptons where people buy shares. Where people basically 3 and 4 people sleep in the same
So there's
home.
discriminatory enforcement. And is this only in Suffolk? Where else is this happening locally?
Well, I think that you're getting a reaction from many people. I think that the movement had an impact in 2 ways. One, to mobilize folks that are supportive of immigration rights, but it also mobilized the other end of the formula, which are the folks that don't want to do this.
You talked about the established groups. We've talked about them not being in the forefront, somewhat asleep. What about the legislature? I mean, the legislature is accused of being asleep on so many different matters that being asleep on immigration is almost like you're still asleep. What is
We're like sort of like a sleeping bear. Right?
Nice. No, I don't know even about the bear, but what's going on in the state legislature?
Well,
you're the sponsor of a couple of bills.
Immigration is a federal issue, so to some degree, the state legislature is confined to, play a role of making recommendations through resolutions. But there are some issues where we can weigh in. The driver's license issue is one that's, I think, on the table now. We got a new governor. We got a new Homeland Security czar, a former state senator, Balboni. We have discussions with him about the 3 different bills that are on the table, the Ortiz bill, the Peralta bill, and a bill that I carry that proposes to address this issue in different ways. I think that we have to take a look at the Real ID Act. Some states have opted out of the Real...
this is the REALID Act.
Correct.
Just briefly explain.
Well, I think that some states are looking at it from a fiscal perspective, and they're seeing that Washington is not really providing the funding for them to enforce that, so they're looking to opt out. So we, as a trailblazer state, if we may, California and New York, we may want to look at the possibility of opting out. I submitted a resolution asking for that. We're looking at legislation that has been introduced in other states to do that. But that's the first step, and I think that the driver's license issue is one of security or Homeland Security.
Okay.
How can you have 300,000 people living in the shadows? I think that there's a way to do this and to do it effectively so people can get back to work, so they can drive their kids to school, so they can go to the hospitals when they're sick without being afraid that they're going to get caught by the INS. So that this is a real issue. A lot of the marginals that live in half Republican, half Democrat districts have trouble with these issues, and of course the Republican leadership has for a long time. I've been on the other side.
Okay. You also have a bill, Assembly Bill 4653, which deals with state-aided scholarship opportunities for CUNY students, SUNY students, and community college students. Briefly,
this is a follow-up to another bill that I had that passed several years ago, which allowed undocumented students to pay a regular tuition. At that point, the Pataki administration was and SUNY was looking to implement an increase, a 300% increase on tuition, and we passed legislation that allow undocumented students to pay regular tuition rates. And it follows, that we should introduce also a bill that would allow them to have access to scholarships and other benefits that are funded by the state, not the federal funding, so that they can go to school, because many of them, what they find is that, okay, they got the ability to go to college, but they still don't have the $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 that they need to have to pay for tuition. So this is a no-brainer, sort of like a follow, sort of like a local Dream Act bill.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay. Let's move a little bit to politics and then back to substance. 2008 presidential election. You've got 3 Republican primarily 3 Republican candidates and 3 Dems. The Republican candidates all are sort of center-right, basically supporting the Bush proposal with modifications. I mean, Sunday, the 22nd Times talking about Rudy Giuliani on immigration, really sort of flipping. Is this a third rail? Talk about the 2008 politics. The Democrats aren't talking about it.
Well, I think what happens with immigration is that unlike the war in Iraq, which unites the Democrats and divides the Republicans, the issue of immigration unites the Republicans and divides the Democrats, in the sense that there are a significant number of Democrats who fear that immigration for them is not a winning issue, or trying to regularize the status of the millions who are already here. And so the Democratic Party is divided on this, and as a result, the presidential candidates who are depending in their early rounds on the active Democratic Party voters don't want to touch the issue. And I think that the reality is that, and see, this is where I think the question of all of these different bills. The problem is the country does not want to come to grips with the fact that in a world of international capital, the question of labor moving across boundaries is not only important for the United States, it's important for every advanced country. France doesn't know what to do with all the Tunisians and the Moroccans and Algerians. England doesn't know what to do about all the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Jamaicans. Germany doesn't know what to do about the Turks. The reality of international capital spreading all over the world is that it has resulted in this huge flow of third world labor into the advanced Western countries. No piece of legislation is going to affect the realities of what's happening in the world today. The question is then, how do you deal with the fact that nations are becoming increasingly international in the character of their populations? And how do you, instead of trying to erect barriers, try to figure out how to deal with this? And I think the politicians don't want to touch this. They don't want to touch the reality for human beings of an increasingly global economy.
What then happens in 2007, 2008 at the federal and state levels? Nothing because of this toxicity, this electricity, to continue the metaphor.
It's very political. I think that we're gearing up for a presidential election. I think that's where the focus is. And I think that candidates on both sides of the aisles are looking at real practical on-the-ground results. And they're looking, for example, at the border states. You know, how do you win New Mexico and Arizona? And how do you win Texas? And how do you make wedge into Florida and even Southern California? You know, how do you do that so that you are competitive in this next presidential election? And you will see Democrats siding with, support for the wall and some moderate positions on immigration because they don't want to lose those states. So it's a real practical analysis that's being driven by, polls and consultants and people around these candidates, and not really the humanistic aspect or the real practical economical analysis of this whole immigration pattern that Juan, explain to us. I think that they're not looking at that.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and then you have the Republicans have their own problems because their corporate financial base wants to see immigration reform because they need they understand they need the labor.
Which is Juan's point.
And the Department of Labor says that they're going to need the labor. So it's an inescapable fact that there's going to be a shortage of young labor in America in the next 20 years. But in order to get through the primaries, the individuals like McCain and Giuliani, who have a long history of supporting, justice for undocumented immigrants, are now backing away because their voting base, while their financial base may want legalization, their voting base doesn't. So it's.
But I would also argue that voting base has been conditioned as a result of a carefully orchestrated campaign that's been going on. Take the Lou Dobbs show. Now, on a good night, Lou Dobbs doesn't get more than 1 million people watching that show. And that's on a good night. But the fact is that for the last 5 years, he has been hitting the issue of immigration every single night. Every day, every night. Imagine if you had a show on even on MSNBC, which has less of an audience than Lou Dobbs, every single night presenting a different perspective to the American people on the issue of immigration. Let's say if Alan had a national television show every night talking about immigration, that I think that the fact is that Lou Dobbs has had an enormous impact on the debate, and an enormous impact in a bad way in terms of consolidating the worst fears of Americans, because let's not forget, yes, all of these countries have to deal with immigration, but no country, none of those, France, England, Germany, all the others, were a nation of immigrants to begin with. So immigration policy has always been at the heart of national politics in America. This is not the first time where we have a huge immigration debate. This is about the 10th time this country has had a huge immigration debate. And it's always scapegoating the most recent arrivals and winning the former arrivals to a consolidated position against the new arrivals.
Oh, okay. So there is demographics is destiny, but it's one generation separate.
It's really like a campaign of fear. And if you see, you know, it's funny because some of the folks that I hear from in Suffolk County that are corporate, they're upset about the policies being implemented by Levy and some of those folks out there. They don't want to have a bad reputation out there. He's appealing to another strata of society that maybe is fearful that these foreigners are going to take their jobs, you know, that they're all of a sudden they're going to have to mow the lawns. You know, I think that it is a campaign of fear, and traditionally that's the way it's been. I mean, you read the history books, and we're not living a different era than in the past.
Okay, let me ask the question: are there legitimate concerns by folks out there that, in some way, as John McWhorter of the Manhattan Institute said, is that some new immigrants, and I guess old immigrants as well, look at the United States as an opportunity rather than identity. And I think that's part of the trigger of the fear, that in some sense, even though historically we've gone through this before, that there is less of a commitment to the homeland, meaning my home here, rather than my home back there. Is there an element to that?
Well, I do this. I see it in two ways. You know, first of all, you know, I'm from the Dominican Republic. You can basically fly every weekend out there if you like to and keep some type of connection, umbilical cord, with the island. But the Dominican community had a real commitment in becoming U.S. citizens. You know, you just need to travel and you see the lines now when you come back, whereas before, you know, the non-U.S. passport lines were tremendous. Now it's the other way around. I mean, there has been a real commitment to become a U.S. citizen, whether it is to, you know, bring the kids to the United States and reunite the family, or whether it is because some folks really have a deep-rooted appreciation for the nation, and because they see the ability to prosper here and the rights and privileges that the Constitution gives you. But there has been an actual commitment, and we have done a tremendous job at making a good percentage, and I'm sure Alan handles the numbers, you know, of Dominicans are now, you know, U.S. citizens. So I don't see a lack of nationalism, if you may, for new immigrants.
But I would say there's probably some national differences there because, for instance, the Mexican community, first of all, we must understand 65% of the, quote, illegal immigration problem in the United States is from Mexico. One country. One country represents 2/3 of the immigration problem, and that's to be expected. We have a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. It's a poor country, but it's also part of the Southwest. Used to be part of Mexico, so it's not that big a deal in Mexican consciousness to go back and forth. And the reality is that Mexicans, for the most part, were the one group that resisted citizenship because they saw going to the United States as an issue of just going to work for a while, being able to get enough money to go back home. They didn't see it as a permanent thing. As a result of the crackdowns in recent years, that's changed. So more and more Mexicans are being forced to become, to apply for citizenship because they can no longer go back and forth the way they can.
But that gets to the notion of then I could follow this sort of the Dobbsian argument saying that it's purely instrumental, and in a sense they had to force this pseudo-identification, but they really don't have it.
Because what happened is NAFTA, when NAFTA was created to make the American common market, unlike the European common market, which allowed the free flow of labor in between countries, NAFTA was only a free flow of labor for capital and not for labor. And the reality is that the Mexican economy and the U.S. economy are so linked. There should be some way to establish free flow of labor back and forth between the two countries.
Okay. I hit the lotto. I can afford a $500 million presidential campaign. I want you two guys advising me on national policy. Give me in an earful a minute of what you see as my key domestic immigration agenda.
I think that the philosophy on immigration in this country is shifting. The pendulum is shifting. If I was a young politician, perhaps from Illinois, I would look towards the future. And there are several politicians running for president from that state, by the way. I would look to get on that bandwagon. I will still support some of the security issues, from a moderate position, but certainly a right path to citizenship, and bringing a new set of Americans to the table that will be, I think, very patriotic, be very grateful and very productive for this nation. And I think a motivating voting bloc. If you want to really put it on practical terms, new immigrants that have become citizens are motivated to go out and vote. And I think you see the numbers across the states on how that happens. I would try to garnish the support of that group.
I'm convinced.
And well, as a journalist, I don't advise politicians. I can only tell you that that seeing what's going on out there, the immigration movement is a new civil rights movement of our time, and everyone has to decide what side they're on.
Okay, thank you. Alan, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank the Daily News and CUNY for sponsoring this event. I want to remind people that we're going to be seeing a lot of debate about this topic in the coming period, and stay tuned.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, sir. And this then concludes a special 5-part City Talk series on immigration. Come back.